I never thought a paint color would land me in the middle of a legal nightmare that would make national news. But there I was, standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, staring at a middle-aged woman with a blonde bob haircut, holding a clipboard like it was the Holy Grail itself. "Mr. Yates, I'm Barbara from the Homeowners Association, and we need to discuss your property immediately," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut through the crisp October air in Charleston, South Carolina. I just moved into this beautiful Victorian-style house 3 months ago. A dream come true after years of saving and working my tail off as an architectural consultant. The house was painted a gorgeous deep burgundy with cream trim, which I thought perfectly complemented the historic character of the neighborhood. Apparently, Barbara disagreed. "Good morning to you too," I said, trying to keep my tone pleasant despite the early hour. "What seems to be the problem?" She thrust a stack of papers at me. "Your house color is in direct violation of our HOA guidelines. Section 4.2, subsection C clearly states that all exterior paint must be approved earth tones. That burgundy is absolutely unacceptable." I took the papers, scanning them quickly. "Barbara, when I bought this house, it was already this color. The previous owner had it painted like this. That was Old Man Henderson, and he was 93 years old with dementia. We gave him a pass. You, however, are young and capable of following rules. You have 30 days to repaint your house in an approved color. I recommend beige." "Beige? This entire house?" "Desert sand beige, to be specific. It's option number 7 on our approved color palette." She tapped her clipboard with a manicured nail. "30 days, Mr. Yates. After that, we'll be forced to levy daily fines of $500 until compliance is achieved." Before I could argue further, she marched back to her white SUV and drove off, leaving me standing there in my pajamas, papers in hand, wondering what I'd gotten myself into. I spent the rest of that Saturday morning reading through the entire HOA covenant. It was 78 pages of the most mind-numbing bureaucratic language I'd ever encountered, and I worked with building codes for a living. The paint section was indeed clear. Earth tones only, pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee, which apparently consisted of Barbara and 2 other board members. The problem was, I really loved my house the way it looked. The burgundy paint had been professionally done, and it highlighted the intricate Victorian details beautifully. More than that, something about Barbara's demanding attitude made me want to dig my heels in. I decided to do some research. As an architectural consultant, I had access to historical building databases and registries. I started pulling records on my property, curious about its history. What I found made my jaw drop. My house, built in 1887 by a prominent Charleston merchant named Cornelius Thaddeus Harper, was listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The registration had been filed in 1976, long before the HOA was even established in 1995. According to the documentation, the original color scheme was noted as burgundy with cream trim, exactly what it was now. I sat back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. If my house was a registered historical landmark, the HOA couldn't force me to change anything that would alter its historical character. Federal law trumped HOA covenants. Monday morning, I called the South Carolina State Historic Preservation Office. A helpful woman named Janet confirmed everything I'd found. Not only was my house protected, but any changes to its exterior would require approval from the State Historic Preservation Board. "So if someone tried to force me to paint it a different color," I asked. "That would be a violation of federal historic preservation laws," Janet explained. The National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 protects registered properties. You might want to get documentation from us to present to whoever is giving you trouble." She emailed me official documents within an hour. I printed them out, feeling quite pleased with myself, and drove to the HOA office that afternoon. The office was located in a strip mall off Highway 17, sandwiched between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Inside, I found Barbara sitting behind a desk, along with another woman who introduced herself as Patricia, the HOA president. Patricia was in her late 50s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She looked like she'd never smiled a day in her life. "Mr. Yates," Patricia said, standing to shake my hand with a grip that could crack walnuts. "Barbara told me about your visit. I hope you're here to discuss your paint timeline. Actually, I'm here to inform you that I won't be repainting my house at all." I laid the documents on her desk. "My property is a registered historical landmark. Federal law protects it from alterations that would compromise its historical integrity. The current paint color is documented as the original scheme from 1887. Barbara's face went red. "That's impossible. We've been running this HOA for 15 years. Someone would have mentioned it." "Clearly not," I said. "But feel free to call the State Historic Preservation Office. Janet Parker can confirm everything." Patricia picked up the documents, reading through them with increasing irritation. "This doesn't change our authority. You signed the HOA covenant when you purchased the property." "An HOA covenant can't supersede federal law," I pointed out. "I checked with my real estate attorney this morning." "You have no legal standing to force me to change the exterior of a registered historical landmark." "We'll see about that," Patricia said coldly. "This meeting is over." I left feeling victorious, but my celebration was short-lived. 2 weeks later, I received a formal notice of violation with a $5,000 fine attached. I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Webb, immediately. Marcus was in his early 40s, known for being aggressive in property disputes, and he was not happy when I read him the notice. "They're doing what?" he practically shouted into the phone. "Peter, this is insane. You gave them documentation. They're opening themselves up to a massive lawsuit." "So what do I do?" "Don't pay that fine. Forward me everything. I'm going to draft a response that will make them wish they'd never heard of desert sand beige." Marcus worked fast. Within 3 days, he'd sent a 10-page letter to the HOA citing federal law, state law, and about 15 different legal precedents. He also included a demand that they rescind the fine and issue a formal apology. The HOA's response was to double the fine and schedule a hearing. The hearing was held on a Wednesday evening in the community clubhouse. I arrived with Marcus, who carried a briefcase full of documents. The room was set up like a courtroom, with Patricia, Barbara, and a third board member named Richard sitting at a table at the front. About 20 other neighborhood residents filled the chairs behind us, apparently there to watch the show. "This hearing will come to order," Patricia announced, banging a gavel like she was a real judge. "We're here to address the continued violation of HOA guidelines by Peter Yates regarding the unauthorized paint color at 427 Magnolia Street." Marcus stood up. "Before we proceed, I'd like to enter into the record that this entire hearing is a farce. Mr. Yates's property is protected under federal law, and this board has no authority to demand changes to it." "Your objection is noted and overruled," Patricia said. "Mr. Yates, you have 5 minutes to present your case." "There is no case," I said, standing. "My house is a registered historical landmark. The paint color is the original color documented when the property was registered in 1976. Federal law, specifically the National Historic Preservation Act, protects this property. Your covenant doesn't apply. Barbara stood up, her face flushed. This is a matter of neighborhood aesthetics. Your house is an eyesore. We have standards to maintain and property values to protect. Property values. I couldn't help but laugh. My house is worth more because it's a historical landmark. If anything, having a registered historic property in the neighborhood increases everyone else's property values. That's not the point, Richard chimed in. He was a thin man in his 60s, wearing a polo shirt with the neighborhood logo on it. The point is community standards. When you bought here, you agreed to follow our rules. Marcus pulled out a thick document. I have here a copy of the National Historic Preservation Act, along with relevant case law. In Stevens v. Pinewood HOA, a federal court ruled that HOA covenants cannot enforce restrictions that would alter the historical character of a registered property. In Martinez v. Sunset Hills Community Association, the HOA was forced to pay damages when they attempted to fine a homeowner for maintaining historically accurate features. Do you really want to go down this path? Patricia's jaw tightened. We'll take your arguments under advisement. This hearing is adjourned. We'll issue our decision within 7 days. As we filed out, an elderly man approached me. He had white hair and kind eyes, and he introduced himself as George Pemberton. I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, he said. Before the HOA existed, even. Your house is one of the most beautiful in Charleston. Don't let them bully you. Thank you, I said, genuinely touched. I'm trying not to. Old man Henderson loved that house, George continued. He used to tell me stories about researching its history. That's why he had it repainted in the original colors 10 years ago. Cost him a fortune, but he said it was worth it to honor the history. This was news to me. Henderson had it researched. Oh yes, spent months at the Historical Society. He even found photographs from the 1890s showing the colors. He was very particular about getting it right. This information could be useful. Do you know if he kept any of that research? His daughter might have it. She lives over in Mount Pleasant. Her name is Dorothy. Dorothy Carlyle now. I can get you her number if you'd like. I got Dorothy's number and called her that evening. She was delighted to hear from someone who cared about her father's house. Dad loved that place more than anything, she said, her voice warm. When he found out it was on the historical register, he became obsessed with restoring it properly. He kept all his research in binders. I still have them in my garage. Would you like to see them? The next day, I drove to Dorothy's house in Mount Pleasant. She was a woman in her 60s, with her father's kind eyes. She led me to her garage, where she pulled out 3 large binders full of documents, photographs, and notes. Dad was a retired engineer, she explained. When he got interested in something, he went all in. He documented everything about that house's history. I spent 2 hours going through the binders. Henderson had been incredibly thorough. He'd found architectural drawings from 1887, photographs from various decades, paint analysis reports, and extensive correspondence with the State Historic Preservation Office. The original burgundy and cream color scheme was documented beyond any doubt. Can I make copies of these? I asked. Take the originals, Dorothy said. I've been meaning to donate them to the Historical Society anyway. If they'll help you fight those HOA busybodies, all the better. They gave my dad grief in his final years, even though they knew he wasn't well. It wasn't right. Armed with Henderson's research, Marcus and I prepared for whatever the HOA board decided. Their decision came via certified mail on Saturday. The board had ruled against me. Not only did they uphold the original fine, but they'd increased it to $25,000 and given me 14 days to begin repainting or face additional daily fines of $1,000. "They've lost their minds," Marcus said when I showed him the letter. "This is beyond aggressive. This is vindictive. What do? We file suit. Federal court. We're going after them for violation of federal law, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, and we're seeking damages." The lawsuit was filed Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, my phone was ringing off the hook. Apparently, word had spread through the neighborhood and people were taking sides. Some supported me. George Pemberton organized a group of longtime residents who remembered when the neighborhood appreciated its historical character. Others, particularly newer residents who'd bought into the HOA's vision of uniformity, thought I was a troublemaker destroying property values. Barbara called me directly Tuesday evening. Her voice was sickeningly sweet. "Peter, I think we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we meet for coffee and discuss this like reasonable adults? Barbara, I have an attorney. All communication should go through him." "Oh, don't be like that. We're neighbors. We should work together. I'm sure we can find a compromise." "There's no compromise on federal law." "What if we made an exception in your case? We could amend the covenants to allow historical properties to maintain original colors. Would you drop the lawsuit then?" This was interesting. "Why the sudden change of heart? We just want what's best for the community." "Lawsuits are expensive and divisive. I wasn't buying it. I'll discuss it with my attorney." When I told Marcus about the call, he laughed. "They're scared. Good, let them sweat. Don't agree to anything." But the next day, things took a disturbing turn. I came home from work to find my house had been vandalized. Someone had thrown paint-filled balloons at the front, leaving beige splatters across the burgundy siding. I called the police immediately. Officer Daniels took my report and photographed the damage. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked. "I'm in a dispute with my HOA. It's gotten pretty heated." He nodded slowly. "I've heard about this case, actually. My wife follows the neighborhood Facebook group. There's been quite a bit of drama. That's putting it mildly. Do you have security cameras?" I didn't, but that was about to change. I had a complete security system installed the next day, with cameras covering every angle of the property. Marcus filed an amended complaint, adding the vandalism to our lawsuit, and requesting a restraining order against the HOA board members from coming within 100 feet of my property. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Sandra Montgomery, granted a temporary restraining order and scheduled a preliminary hearing for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, the story hit the local news. A reporter named Victoria Hammond from Charleston's NBC affiliate contacted me for an interview. "Mr. Yates, this story is fascinating. A historical landmark, federal law, an HOA demanding you paint it beige. This is exactly the kind of David versus Goliath story people love. Would you be willing to go on camera?" I discussed it with Marcus, who thought it was a great idea. Public opinion can be powerful. If we can make the HOA look like the bad guys they are, it might push them to settle. The interview aired during the evening news. Victoria did an excellent job, filming the house from multiple angles, showing how beautiful the burgundy and cream looked against the historic architecture. She interviewed Dorothy about her father's research, George about the neighborhood's history, and me about the legal battle. When they contacted the HOA for comment, Patricia declined to appear on camera but issued a statement saying the board was committed to maintaining community standards. The story went viral. By the next morning, it had been picked up by national news outlets. My phone exploded with calls from reporters, producers, and even a few documentary filmmakers. The story had struck a chord. Government overreach, historical preservation, and a homeowner fighting for his rights. The attention brought unexpected support. The National Trust for Historic Preservation issued a statement backing my case. The South Carolina Historical Society offered to file an amicus brief. Even the mayor of Charleston called to express his support for preserving the city's historic character. But the attention also intensified the opposition. The neighborhood Facebook group became a war zone. Barbara and her supporters posted constantly about my selfish disregard for community harmony. They claimed I was bringing negative attention to the neighborhood and hurting property values. One post from Barbara particularly annoyed me. "Peter Yates thinks he's above the rules that the rest of us follow. If everyone acted like him, society would collapse." The preliminary hearing arrived. Judge Montgomery's courtroom was packed with reporters, neighborhood residents, and curious observers. Marcus presented our case methodically, walking through the federal protections, the historical documentation, and the HOA's escalating harassment. "Your Honor," Marcus concluded, "the HOA is attempting to force Mr. Yates to destroy the historical integrity of a federally protected landmark. This is not a matter of community standards. This is a violation of federal law, and it needs to stop immediately." The HOA's attorney, a nervous-looking young man named Todd Stevens, argued that the HOA covenant was a binding contract and that historical landmark status didn't exempt properties from local community rules. Judge Montgomery interrupted him. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that an HOA covenant supersedes federal law?" "Not supersedes, Your Honor, but rather that both can coexist. Mr. Yates can maintain his house as a historical landmark while also following community aesthetic guidelines. By painting a historically accurate burgundy house beige." The judge's tone made clear what she thought of that argument. "I'm making the restraining order permanent. The HOA is prohibited from fining Mr. Yates or taking any action regarding his property's exterior. We'll proceed to trial on the damages claim. Is the HOA interested in settlement discussions?" Todd Stevens conferred with Patricia and Barbara, who were sitting behind him looking furious. "Not at this time, Your Honor." "Very well. Trial is set for 8 weeks from today." This hearing is adjourned. As we left the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Marcus gave a brief statement about being pleased with the judge's ruling and looking forward to trial. Barbara pushed through the crowd, getting right in my face. "You think you've won. This isn't over. We'll fight you every step of the way." "That's your choice," I said calmly, very aware of the cameras recording everything. "But you're fighting federal law, not me. You've divided this neighborhood. You've brought shame on all of us with your selfishness." Victoria stepped between us with her microphone. "Miss Barbara, can you explain why the HOA is so determined to paint over a historically accurate color on a registered landmark?" "Community standards matter," Barbara snapped. "We have rules for a reason. Even when those rules violate federal law." Barbara's face went purple. She turned and stormed off, with Patricia hurrying after her. The confrontation made the evening news. Public opinion turned even more decisively against the HOA. The neighborhood Facebook group saw a rebellion, with dozens of residents speaking out against the board's handling of the situation. A resident named Martin posted, "I've lived here for 12 years and always thought the HOA was too controlling. This situation is ridiculous. Peter's house is beautiful and historically important. The board needs to resign." Another resident, Susan, wrote, "I'm embarrassed to tell people I live in this neighborhood now. The whole country is watching us try to destroy a piece of history over beige paint. It's insane." The momentum seemed to be in my favor, but I should have known Barbara wouldn't give up easily. 2 days after the hearing, I received a notice that the HOA had filed a complaint with the city about various alleged code violations at my property. Overgrown landscaping, improper trash can storage, and a dangerous crack in my driveway. I walked around my property with a clipboard, checking each claim. The landscaping was immaculate. I'd hired a professional service. My trash cans were in the garage except on collection day. The dangerous crack in my driveway was a hairline fracture maybe 3 inches long. "They're making stuff up," I told Marcus. "Document everything. Take photos. Get statements from your landscaping company. We'll add harassment to the lawsuit." The city inspector came out the following week. His name was Carl, and he looked tired before he even got out of his truck. "Let me guess," he said. "HOA dispute. How'd you know? Because these complaints are BS. I've been doing this job for 20 years. I can spot a harassment complaint from a mile away." He walked around anyway, taking notes. "Your property is fine. Better than fine, actually. I'll file a report saying no violations found. But I'll be honest with you, they'll probably just file more complaints." "Can't you do something about false complaints?" "Not really. Anyone can file a complaint. We have to investigate each one. It's a waste of city resources, but until they do something criminal, my hands are tied." Carl's report cleared me of all alleged violations, but he was right about more complaints coming. Over the next month, the HOA filed 6 more complaints with the city, each more ridiculous than the last. My mailbox was crooked. My house numbers were too small. A tree branch was encroaching on the sidewalk. Each complaint required a city inspection. Each inspection found nothing wrong. Carl started apologizing every time he showed up. "I know this is harassment," he told me during his 4th visit. "I've documented in my reports that these complaints appear to be retaliatory and without merit. If you want to file a complaint with the city against the HOA, I'll support it." I took Carl's advice and filed a formal complaint with Charleston's city manager about the HOA's abuse of the code enforcement system. The city sent a warning letter to the HOA board. This only made Barbara angrier. She started showing up at my house at random times, always staying just outside the restraining order's boundary, taking photos and notes on a clipboard. When I'd come out to confront her, she'd claim she was documenting more violations. "You're harassing me," I said during one encounter. "I'm performing my duties as an HOA board member. I have a right to inspect properties for covenant violations. From the street with a telephoto lens. I'm not on your property. I'm not within 100 feet. I'm following the court order perfectly." She was technically right, which made it even more infuriating. I installed additional cameras to document her surveillance, and Marcus added it to our growing list of grievances. As the trial date approached, Marcus received the HOA's defense strategy through discovery. It was surprisingly aggressive. They planned to argue that my house wasn't actually historically significant, that the burgundy color was not original, and that I'd known about the HOA restrictions before purchasing and therefore had assumed the risk. "They're going to challenge the historical landmark designation," I asked Marcus in disbelief. "Apparently. They've hired an architectural historian to dispute the color scheme, some guy named Dr. Philip Morrison." I looked him up. Dr. Morrison had a PhD in architectural history, but his recent work seemed to consist mainly of testifying for developers who wanted to demolish old buildings. He was a hired gun. "We need our own expert," Marcus said. We hired Dr. Eliner Vasquez, a respected architectural historian from the College of Charleston, who'd written extensively about Victorian-era buildings in the region. When I showed her Henderson's research and the original registration documents, her eyes lit up. "This is extraordinary documentation," she said. "The paint analysis, the period photographs, the architectural drawings. There's no question about the historical accuracy. Who's arguing against this? Dr. Philip Morrison." She frowned. "Phil Morrison, he's a hack. He'll say whatever he's paid to say." "Don't worry, the evidence is overwhelmingly on your side." The trial began on a Monday in late January. Judge Montgomery's courtroom was packed again, with even more media presence than before. The story had captured national attention as a symbol of HOA overreach. Marcus delivered a powerful opening statement, laying out how the HOA had violated federal law, harassed me, filed false complaints, and wasted city resources in a vendetta against a property owner who'd simply wanted to maintain his historical home. Todd Stevens, the HOA's attorney, argued that this was about contract law and community standards, not history or harassment. Mr. Yates signed a covenant. He agreed to follow the rules. The HOA is simply enforcing that covenant. The first witness was Janet Parker from the State Historic Preservation Office. She confirmed that my property was registered in 1976 and that the burgundy and cream color scheme was documented as historically accurate. Todd's cross-examination tried to suggest the registration was old and possibly outdated. "Miss Parker, isn't it true that historical designations are sometimes removed or revised?" "Yes, but that hasn't happened with this property. The registration is active and current." "But the HOA wasn't consulted when this property was registered, were they?" "The HOA didn't exist in 1976, and they don't have authority over federal historical designations anyway." Next, Dr. Vasquez testified about the historical significance of the house and the accuracy of the color scheme. She walked the jury through Henderson's research, the paint analysis, and period photographs. "In my professional opinion," she concluded, "the current burgundy and cream color scheme is not only historically accurate but essential to the property's character as a Victorian-era merchant's residence. Painting it beige would be a tragedy and a violation of the property's historical integrity." Todd brought out Dr. Morrison for the HOA's case. Morrison testified that the color scheme couldn't be definitively proven and that beige would be a reasonable approximation of period-appropriate colors. On cross-examination, Marcus destroyed him. "Dr. Morrison, how much is the HOA paying you for your testimony? I'm being compensated for my time and expertise." "How much?" $15,000. "And in the past 5 years, how many times have you testified in favor of preserving a historical building versus demolishing or altering one?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "I'd have to check my records." "I can help. You've testified 23 times. 22 of those times, you argued against historical preservation. Isn't that correct?" "I provide honest expert opinions based on the evidence." Marcus pulled out a publication. "You wrote an article in 2019 titled "The Tyranny of Historical Preservation." In it, you argued that historical designations unfairly restrict property owners. Yet now you're arguing that this HOA should be able to restrict a property owner's historically accurate restoration. Which is it, Dr. Morrison?" The jury seemed unimpressed with Morrison's stammering response. The most dramatic testimony came from Dorothy Carlyle, Henderson's daughter. She described her father's love for the house and his meticulous research into its history. "My father spent his retirement honoring this house's past," she said, her voice emotional. "He believed that preserving history was a sacred trust. When the HOA started harassing him about the paint, it broke his heart. He died thinking he'd failed to protect something important. Peter is finishing what my father started." Several jurors were visibly moved. Then Marcus called me to the stand. I testified about buying the house, the first encounter with Barbara, discovering the historical designation and everything that had followed. "Why didn't you just paint it beige?" Todd asked on cross-examination. "Wouldn't that have been easier?" "Because it would be wrong," I said simply. "This house is a piece of Charleston's history. It's been standing for almost 140 years. Who am I to destroy that because an HOA board wants everything to look the same? History matters. Heritage matters. Some things are more important than making Barbara happy." The gallery erupted in applause. Judge Montgomery gavelled for order but couldn't quite hide her smile. Barbara took the stand for the HOA. Marcus questioned her about the escalating fines, the false code complaints, and the harassment. "Miss Barbara, you filed 6 code complaints against Mr. Yates in 2 months. All were found to be without merit. Why?" "I believe those were legitimate violations. A mailbox being crooked by half an inch is a legitimate violation. It's about standards. Or is it about punishing Mr. Yates for not doing what you demanded?" "I was doing my job as an HOA board member." Marcus showed the jury photos of Barbara surveilling my property. "Is photographing a homeowner's house repeatedly part of your job?" "I was documenting violations." "What violations?" "The city found none." "You were harassing Mr. Yates because he wouldn't obey you, isn't that true?" Barbara's face flushed red. "He violated the covenant. He refused to follow the rules. Rules that violate federal law. The HOA has authority in this neighborhood. Not over federal law, not over history, and not over Mr. Yates's property rights." The final witness was Carl, the city code inspector. He testified about the multiple false complaints and how they'd wasted city resources. "In my professional opinion," Carl said, "these complaints were filed in bad faith as a form of harassment. I've never seen such a clear pattern of retaliatory code complaints." Closing arguments were powerful on both sides, but Marcus's was particularly effective. He held up a photograph of my house. "This is what the HOA wants to destroy, not just a color scheme but a piece of living history." Why? Because they value conformity over heritage, they value control over culture, they value their power over federal law. Don't let them. Send a message that history matters, that the law matters, that homeowners have rights that HOA boards can't trample. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found in my favor on every count. Not only did they rule that the HOA had violated federal law, but they awarded me damages. $50,000 for harassment, $30,000 for emotional distress, and full reimbursement of all legal fees, which totaled over $60,000. The courtroom erupted. Media rushed to get comments. Barbara stormed out, refusing to speak to anyone. Judge Montgomery addressed the HOA board directly. "I am ordering this board to undergo training on federal historic preservation law and homeowners' rights. You have 30 days to rescind all fines against Mr. Yates and issue a formal written apology. Any further action against his property will result in contempt charges." Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us. Victoria was there with her crew. "Peter, how do you feel about the verdict?" "Relieved, vindicated. This was never about me versus the HOA. It was about protecting something bigger than any of us. History belongs to everyone, and it's our responsibility to preserve it." "What's next?" "I'm going home to my burgundy house, and I'm going to enjoy living in a piece of Charleston's history." The verdict made national headlines. HOA ordered to pay $140,000 for trying to paint over history, read one typical headline. The story sparked a broader conversation about HOA overreach and the importance of historical preservation. But Barbara and Patricia weren't done yet. They refused to issue the apology or pay the damages, claiming they'd appeal. Marcus filed a motion to enforce the judgment. Judge Montgomery was not pleased when we appeared back in her courtroom 2 weeks later. "The board is refusing to comply with the court's order," she asked incredulously. "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus said. "They've also continued to assess fines against Mr. Yates in direct violation of your order." Patricia stood up, ignoring Todd Stevens's attempts to stop her. "Your Honor, we have a duty to the community. We can't allow one person to undermine the neighborhood." "You have a duty to follow the law," Judge Montgomery snapped. "The law I represent, which is apparently something you don't respect. I'm finding you in contempt. Each board member is fined $5,000, payable immediately. If compliance isn't achieved within 7 days, the fine doubles every week." Barbara jumped up. "This is outrageous. We're just trying to maintain property values." "Sit down, Miss Barbara. You're dangerously close to jail time for contempt." That finally seemed to get through to them. Todd Stevens negotiated a payment schedule, and the HOA issued a terse, clearly reluctant apology letter. But the drama still wasn't over. 2 days after the contempt hearing, George Pemberton called me, his voice urgent. "Peter, you need to see this. There's a petition circulating to recall the entire HOA board. It already has over 200 signatures. A recall election was scheduled for 6 weeks out. The neighborhood was mobilized like never before." George and several other longtime residents organized a slate of reform candidates who promised to focus on actual community needs rather than paint colors and power trips. Barbara and Patricia ran a defensive campaign, claiming they'd been victimized by an unfair legal system and media bias. It didn't work. The reform slate won in a landslide. Barbara, Patricia, and Richard were all removed from the board. The new president was a retired teacher named Margaret Chen who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years. One of the new board's first acts was to revise the architectural guidelines to explicitly protect historical features and create a streamlined approval process for historically accurate restorations. Margaret called me personally. "Peter, on behalf of the HOA, I want to apologize for what you went through. This should never have happened. Your house is beautiful and it's an asset to our neighborhood. We're proud to have a registered historical landmark here." "Thank you, Margaret. I appreciate that. We're also going to create a historical preservation committee. Would you be interested in serving on it? We could use your expertise." I agreed, pleased that something positive had come from the whole ordeal, but there was one more twist. In March, the FBI contacted me. Agent Williams showed up at my door with a badge and a serious expression. "Mr. Yates, I need to ask you some questions about your HOA's financial practices. I'm not on the board. I don't know anything about their finances. We're investigating possible embezzlement and fraud." Your lawsuit opened up some doors. When the court ordered financial disclosure, we noticed some irregularities. "Can you tell me about the fines you were assessed?" I walked him through everything. He took detailed notes. "Where were those fines supposed to go?" "Into the HOA's general fund, I assume." "That's what we're investigating. It appears several board members may have been diverting fine money into personal accounts." The FBI investigation moved quickly. Within 2 months, federal charges were filed against Barbara, Patricia, and Richard for embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. They'd been running a scheme for years, levying aggressive fines and pocketing portions of the money. My case had been particularly egregious because the fines were so large, but I wasn't their only victim. The investigation uncovered dozens of other homeowners who'd been hit with questionable fines over the years. The trial took place in federal court that fall. All 3 defendants were convicted. Barbara received 4 years in prison. Patricia got 5 years and Richard got 3 years. They were also ordered to pay restitution totaling over $300,000 to affected homeowners. I attended the sentencing hearing. Barbara looked nothing like the confident, aggressive woman who'd confronted me in my driveway. She looked small and defeated. Judge Harrison, the federal judge handling the case, was scathing in his remarks. "You betrayed the trust of your community. You abused your positions of authority. You used fear and intimidation to extract money from your neighbors, and then you stole from them." The sentence reflects not just the financial crimes, but the violation of community trust. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. I'd never wanted anyone to go to prison. I just wanted to keep my house the right color. The story made national news again. HOA board members sentenced to prison in embezzlement scheme was the headline that went viral. My house became a strange sort of tourist attraction, with people occasionally driving by to see the famous burgundy house. Life slowly returned to normal. The new HOA board was reasonable and focused on actual community improvements like park maintenance and neighborhood safety. They organized a historical homes tour, featuring my house prominently, which raised money for local historical preservation efforts. I settled into life in my beautiful burgundy Victorian house. Dorothy donated her father's research to the Charleston Historical Society, where it was used to help document other historic properties in the area. George and I became good friends. He'd often stop by in the evenings and we'd sit on my porch, drinking sweet tea and watching the sunset. "You know," he said one evening, "Old Man Henderson would have loved how this turned out. He fought the HOA too in his own way, just never had the strength for a big legal battle. He did his part by preserving the house properly. I just finished what he started. And sent 3 criminals to prison in the process. That was a bonus." We sat in comfortable silence, looking at the house's burgundy facade glowing in the golden evening light. It really was beautiful, and it represented something important: history preserved, rights protected, and a community that had learned to value heritage over conformity. A year after the verdict, Victoria contacted me about doing a follow-up story. We met at my house and she filmed an update. "Looking back, do you have any regrets?" she asked. "None. Well, maybe one. I wish I'd installed security cameras earlier, would have saved some headaches." "Would you do it all again?" "Absolutely. Some things are worth fighting for." This house stood for 138 years before I bought it. If I'd let the HOA paint it beige, I'd have been erasing a piece of history. That's not something I could live with. What would you say to other homeowners facing similar situations? Know your rights. Document everything. Don't be afraid to stand up for what's right. And if you own a historical property, protect it. You're not just an owner, you're a custodian of history. Future generations are counting on you. The story aired during a special segment on HOA conflicts that had gone national. My case was presented alongside several others, highlighting a growing problem across America: HOAs that had lost sight of their purpose and become more about control than community. The segment helped spark legislative interest. South Carolina introduced a bill to strengthen homeowner protections against HOA overreach and establish clearer guidelines for HOAs dealing with historical properties. I testified at a State House committee hearing, telling my story to a room full of legislators. The bill passed unanimously. It became known informally as the Henderson-Yates Act, honoring both the old man who'd preserved the house and the fight to keep it that way. 3 years after that morning when Barbara first knocked on my door, I stood in the same driveway, but everything was different. The neighborhood was thriving under reasonable HOA leadership. My house had been featured in architectural magazines and preservation journals, and I'd become an unexpected advocate for homeowners' rights and historical preservation. I'd also met someone special. Victoria and I had stayed in touch after the story wrapped, meeting occasionally for coffee to discuss other stories she was working on. Somewhere along the way, those coffee meetings had turned into dates. She moved in 6 months later, charmed by both the house and its stubborn owner. "You know what I love most about this place?" she said one evening as we sat on the porch. "The burgundy paint," she laughed. "Besides that, I love that it represents resistance to mediocrity. Everyone wanted you to make it bland and forgettable. You refused. You fought to keep something beautiful and meaningful alive. That says a lot about who you are." I just didn't want to paint my house beige. It was never really about the paint, though, was it? It was about standing up for what matters. She was right, of course. The fight over my house's color had been about something much bigger. The tension between individual rights and collective rules, between preserving the past and conforming to the present, between standing up for principles and taking the easy path. I'd chosen the hard path, and it had cost me time, money, stress, and peace of mind for many months. But I'd also gained something valuable. The knowledge that I'd done the right thing, protected something important, and helped establish precedent that would protect other homeowners and historic properties. The house stood proudly, its burgundy facade a beacon of history preserved and rights defended. Every time I pulled into the driveway, I felt a surge of pride, not just in winning, but in refusing to surrender something meaningful for the sake of someone else's arbitrary standards. Barbara, Patricia, and Richard were still in prison, their names synonymous with HOA corruption. The new board had become a model for reasonable community governance, often cited in HOA management training as an example of how to do things right. And me. I was just a guy living in a beautiful old house, painted the color it was always meant to be, in a neighborhood that had learned to appreciate its history rather than paint over it. Sometimes at night, when the house was quiet, I'd walk through the rooms and imagine the people who'd lived here before me. Cornelius Thaddeus Harper and his family in the 1890s, the various owners through the decades, Old Man Henderson, carefully researching and restoring, honoring the past. And now me, the accidental guardian who'd fought to preserve what others had maintained before. The house would outlive me, just as it had outlived all its previous occupants. My job was to protect it during my brief tenure, to pass it on to the next custodian in the same or better condition than I'd received it. I'd done that. The historical designation was secure, the legal precedents were established, and the house was protected from future attempts to compromise its character. On the 5th anniversary of buying the house, I threw a party. George came, of course, along with Dorothy, Margaret from the HOA board, Marcus, Victoria's entire family, and dozens of neighbors. We filled the house and spilled out onto the lawn, eating barbecue and celebrating community, history, and the power of standing up for what's right. George raised a glass. To Peter for having the courage to fight, to this beautiful house for standing strong, and to Old Man Henderson who started all this by refusing to let history fade away. We all raised our glasses. To history, I added. May we always have the wisdom to preserve it and the courage to protect it. The party lasted late into the evening, with lights glowing from every window of the old house, bringing it to life as it must have been in its early days, full of people and laughter and celebration. As the last guests departed and Victoria and I cleaned up, I stepped outside for one final look at the house. The burgundy paint glowed softly in the porch light, the cream trim elegant and timeless. It was perfect. It was right. It was worth every moment of the fight. I never did find out who threw those paint-filled balloons at my house in the early days of the conflict. The case remained unsolved, though I had my suspicions. It didn't matter anymore. That act of vandalism had been an attempt to intimidate me into submission, to force me to conform. It had failed. The house stood as testimony to the importance of principle over convenience, of heritage over homogeneity, of courage over compliance. And every morning when I woke up in my beautiful, historically accurate, definitely not beige home, I was reminded that some battles are worth fighting, some hills are worth dying on, and some paint colors are worth defending all the way to federal court. My story had resonated because it touched on something universal, the feeling of being bullied by bureaucracy, of having someone with a little bit of power try to force you into compliance with rules that don't make sense. People across the country had reached out to share their own HOA horror stories, their own battles with petty tyrants wielding clipboards and covenant clauses. I couldn't fight all those battles, but I'd fought mine, and in doing so, I'd helped establish legal precedent and public awareness that would help others. That was something. That mattered. The house was more than just a building now. It was a symbol, a statement, a victory. But most importantly, it was home. My home, painted the right color, protected by law and preserved for the future. And that, in the end, was all I'd ever wanted. To live in my beautiful burgundy house, honoring its history, respecting its character, and knowing I'd done right by the generations before me who'd built and maintained this piece of Charleston's heritage. Barbara had told me that first morning that I had 30 days to paint my house beige. She'd been so certain of her authority, so confident in her power. She'd been wrong about all of it. The house remained burgundy. Justice was served. History was preserved. And I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to comply with unreasonable demands, no matter how official they sound. As I locked the door and turned off the porch light that night, I smiled. Tomorrow I'd wake up in my burgundy house, drink coffee on my historically accurate porch, and live my life in a piece of living history. And nobody, not Barbara, not any HOA board, not anyone, could tell me to paint it beige.